So it's a great pleasure to have Andrew Liu joining us today for the Coronavirus Multi-Species Reading Group. He's offered us two papers, Chinese Virus World Market, as well as a newer piece, the Lab Leak Theory and the Asiatic Form. The first piece was written in March 2020, when we're all very much still trying to figure out what the heck was going on. And I think, even though it was written so early, you more or less nailed it. In my mind, neither the wet market hypothesis or the lab leak theory hold up. It's still a mystery, what I like to call a multi-species mystery about the conditions of emergence. And you're putting your money on kind of the commercial connections, the global linkages, the irrational global system, and also trying to really give us a picture of what Wuhan is as a place. Yeah. I think a lot of the media depictions initially were this, almost made it seem like a little village, but we're talking about a city that's bigger than New York, but also thoroughly unexceptional in the Chinese context. This is, a solid second-tier city, not Chicago really, which is what people are trying to compare it to in the American imaginary. But it's not Beijing, it's not Shanghai, it's not Guangzhou, it's not Hong Kong. It's just this unexceptional city. So maybe and I'm going to point to part of this piece where you're describing what happened right after the initial outbreak. You're talking about the kind of unexceptional people that were doing the unexceptional things that brought the virus from Wuhan to other parts of the world. You talk about a Shenzhen visitor who was visiting family, a tourist who'd visited Vietnam, people who had business ties to Iran. So my working theory is actually not pangolins, not bats, and actually, not other species really, but like tourists. Say, I recently watched the movie Lost in Thailand, which is all about Chinese tourists that visited northern Thailand and had the adventure of their lifetime. And I understand that Chinese tourism to Thailand boomed after that. That was about 10 years ago. And there, thousands of tourists, tens of thousands of tourists visiting Southeast Asia. So what if it's not a multi-species mystery story, but a story of just human travel, a banal story of the 20th century. So maybe I'll just throw that to you and invite you to kind of talk about the conditions of writing this piece, what it was like in March 2020 for you, and how you started to connect these dots.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks everyone for attending and reading the piece. It's always humbling and flattering that anyone read anything you write. So I was just kind of briefly talking about this. I'd written one piece for M+1 before, and I'm kind of like maybe one of the few like on-call China people. So January of 2020, the editor had been asking me, you should write about this. We should write about this COVID thing. And, I'm a professor, I'm teaching, I'm busy, I have a small kid. I'm like, maybe later. And then I was kind of like slowly monitoring it, thinking about obviously what's going on and concerned about what's going on. And also like, what is there to say about it? And then I began to seriously think about writing a piece about a week or two, I guess early March, before things really hit the fan. So I guess I had a little bit of a head start on it. But I remember talking to like on chat with a few friends about the Association for Asian Studies meeting. It was always mid-March, and talking in February, like, is this conference going to happen? Do I have to write my paper for my panel and so on? So those conversations, I think the writing was kind of on the wall for people who were paying attention early on. And the other thing to mention is I don't have direct relatives, and also I've been to Wuhan before for my own research, and I had some interest in it for my research for history. And I had family relatives a long time ago in Wuhan, not anymore. My family moved to Taiwan, as the mainlanders who moved to Taiwan after 49. But there was still this part of in my brain that was always had known a little bit about Wuhan before. So there was another sort of like head start ahead of my head, so I could begin to describe the city. I knew how to kind of frame it historically. There's actually a couple famous books written about it in Chinese history, where the Chicago analogy is mostly that, again, it's not Shanghai, it's not Guangzhou or Hong Kong, but it is probably the biggest, one of the most, the most well-known city in what we call central China. I guess Sichuan is southwest China, so central China. So if if we think of Chicago as the big city of the Midwest, that's pretty appropriate. But kind of knowing full well that most people outside China don't know what Wuhan is. So I thought it would be useful to begin by describing it. And I think the thesis, honestly, I think a lot of my research, historical and public writing, is always to kind of take like cultural, racial stereotypes, ideas about Asia that are often static, and to unpack them, frame Asia as dynamic and frame Asia as part of the rest of the world as the best way to challenge a lot of these stereotypes, not just to say, that's racist and that's bad, but to actually like account for what are these images of Asia, how can you provide a different account, but also account for like, well, why do these stereotypes arise? So in that first piece, I take on what was at the time the dominant theory of the wet market, and the pangolin, but it does seem like who really knows at this point. But like a lot of the discourse around the pangolin theory was like, it's static, traditional, backwards culture. They've been eating pangolins for centuries, or some idea like that, and kind of showing. The other thing is like there's Wuhan, but there's also southern China, which was the origin of SARS and speculatively probably the origin of COVID, in the sense that it seems very similar to viruses found in bats in southern China. And again, southern China, I know about it for family reasons and research reasons, is this really interesting place where it is very dynamic, but it's very much a business culture, but we can frame it in history. And so to kind of unpack the sort of idea of Chinese culture and frame it as actually what we think of as culture is oftentimes, in my view, just kind of a reflection of a particular place's relation to global capitalism, for better, for worse. So that's the first piece. The second piece, I don't know if anyone has read it, but it was kind of accounting for like what has happened since 2020, which is, I think this is true. Since 2020, now in 2022, the vast majority of Americans and people in Western Europe believe in the lab leak theory more than the wet market theory. And so kind of unpacking what is behind the lab leak theories, prominence and plausibility, and just kind of raising this question that there's this kind of generic liberal response that says China and Asian Americans are being targeted because of this very racist, anti-Chinese, xenophobic idea, right? And that's fair enough, but that can't account for wet market being replaced by lab leak. Because if these are both racially motivated, why does one go away? Why does one rise? And so that got me, if you read the piece, I kind of dig into, well, there's different ways of representing what East Asia has meant in the imagination of the rest of the world. Wet market represents a kind of outdated idea that East Asia is backwards, it's the other, and so on, kind of a Edward Saidi Orientalist idea. But I think for much of the world, the image of East Asia that is more resonant is as a sort of hyper-modern, especially China, right? Mega economic power that's going to take over the world. And that kind of stands in diametric opposition to the backwards Islamic world of Said's Orientalism. And if we just stick to this very generic liberal xenophobic script, then we can't account for the differences between those two theories, right? So that's kind of what I was getting at. And for that, I was borrowing a lot from stuff I've been reading recently for Asian American studies that I think is really useful, but is often framed as a domestic conversation, but is actually quite useful for thinking about global, global capitalism, global relations, and things like that. The last thing I'll say, I'll put this in the chat. I was asked to elaborate on the first article for this project called Feral Atlas. I don't know if some of you have heard of this, with Anna Singh, right? It's kind of, over a lot of the same territory as the first article, but I kind of dug even further into this idea of what you were just talking about, that is a sort of like boring global capitalism is how it's spread, like tourism, middle class, students, and so on. I kind of zoom in on this idea of like a just-in-time global shipping system that makes the further spread, the very rapid spread of this stuff is actually by design, right? Because the point of the system is to overcome spatial distance with time, right? With temporal solutions, making things as fast as possible, moving things around as fast as possible. So that's another elaboration on that point, which it was just like a kind of a related think piece related to the first piece.
So thank you. Like usual, if anyone has questions, feel free to just raise your hand, unmute yourself, or type them in the chat. So I see one from Fan.
Hi, apologies for the children's music in the background.
Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. I really wanted to share with you that I'm revising a manuscript on what I call chimerical media or chimerical entanglements.
Right.
And I was just so inspired when I saw what you said in your piece about is rethinking of geography and politics, which is what I also do, especially in relation to media. And so chimerica as a concept is kind of the imaginary geography in a way. So perhaps that would help us rethink what we mean by politics. And I'm calling it kind of relational politics. So I guess one quick question, I have so many questions. Yeah. One quick question is I'm curious if you've been following the more recent outbreaks in China. Yeah. And I feel like I've not been able to follow as closely as I should. But some of my friends who have been observing everything since 2020 also feel like things have also kind of shifted a bit more even. So really curious on your take.
Yeah, what do you mean by they've shifted?
For example, just hanging out with a friend yesterday who's a sociologist, also from China, originally from China, been living here. And he felt like a year ago, maybe he would still in some ways celebrate, or maybe at least indoors, China's quarantine rules. But now he's not sure he's able to do that. The same thing. Just, Curious
so
your take
like
is.
you, I feel guilty. I'm not more up to date on this stuff. I was reading about it recently, and I was also talking to someone who's from Shanghai and following from overseas. And so like for those who don't know, like Shanghai's been under lockdown for several weeks now, and there's been a lot of backlash in the sense that it seems like COVID-0 is a 2020 policy in reaction to the Alpha variant and for a context of an unvaccinated population. Given that Omicron is more contagious, but also less deadly, or we think less deadly, and most of the population is vaccinated, like, do we really need to do COVID-0 anymore? And it seems like, at least on Chinese like social media, like Weibo and like China's Twitter, like there's been people, saying like, why are we quarantining? Why is the city on lockdown? There's hundreds of thousands of cases, but less than 100 deaths, or maybe just over 100 deaths. We should maybe do what, like, I don't know what the other model is, like not the United States, obviously, but we should do what other countries do, which is like have a more flexible policy. And this person I was talking to was saying, kind of following the news from overseas, she was detecting a subtle shift in the Chinese government's rhetoric of bringing in examples from Western Europe as not as opposites of China, but as like, we see, I don't know what the examples were, but we see in this Western European country that it's not that deadly. And with a sort of modified lockdown, the economy and society. So she thought it was like a beginning of a rhetorical pivot by the Chinese Communist Party to relax COVID-0. Because COVID-0, I think, is anachronistic, right, by 2022 in any part of the world. And, unfortunately, it's anachronistic because COVID is not going to be wiped out anytime soon, which is like the initial goal of the 2020 policies. And I've just heard anecdotally, like Hong Kong was closed off, but is slowly opening up. Taiwan's under pressure to slowly relax. So these East Asian countries that were like this pride and joy, right, of the region in 2020, they're kind of coming to grips with like, they're maybe moving into a different stage of the pandemic. That's my impression.
Yeah.
Like you, I'm not following it that closely.
Yeah, one instance that also made me think of your first piece again was actually I haven't really looked into it, but same friend yesterday also mentioned like Tesla was one of the first to reopen to talk about contradictions that you mentioned in the first piece. And just given the kind of economic entanglements that Tesla with China had, that was something to think about, the unevenness of quarantine.
Right.
So, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I have some other things I could ask, but I'll wait till later.
For sure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Paco, go ahead. Your hand's up.
Thanks, Steven. Hello, Andrew. So my question is slightly complicated to ask, but I'll try. So I am looking at all of what has been happening for the past 2 years from central Mexico, mostly Mexico City. And coming from a background in history of science and biology, I tend to think that maybe there are some discussions that have been taking place in China, in Chinese, or in different, languages that are spoken in the country that we don't really know about, and that perhaps some of them have to do with, for instance, traditional Chinese medicine or specific understandings of the relationship between humans and animals, what we in the Western context express as multi-species entanglements, for instance, now that you have told us about your collaboration with Anna Singh in the Feral Atlas project. So is there anything that you could tell us about this? I mean, what do we don't know that is discussed in Chinese and that hasn't, for one reason or another, really been translated?
Yeah. Is there a specific thing that you're wondering about? If you could kind of.
Well, as I said, I don't know if local systems of knowledge that involve ontologies about how a human body is interacting with an animal that you buy in the market, things like that. Not that usually are being now discussed by anthropologists interested in the nature culture dichotomy relationship. That could be one thing, but there could be also stuff that the ethnobiologists study. There are many different things that I could speak about, but I would prefer you to tell us if there's something that related to these ideas that we should be thinking about also.
Right. So to be honest, I'm not reading Chinese language media a lot, but to research the paper, I was looking into this question of why do they eat pangolins? Or in the case of SARS, it was civet cats, which I don't even know if those are, but like a kind of exotic cat in southern China. And my impression was a few things, like these things like traditional Chinese medicine, which is like its own industry and has its own acronym, or eating pangolins. Like there is a history to this stuff that you could say is hundreds and thousands of years old, but it also becomes like standardized and commercialized in the 20th century. And so my impression is, what I was trying to say in the article is like, these things appear quote unquote traditional, right? But in a lot of ways are very modern. And I think there is an industry for TCM as its own distinct form of medicine. I think it is treated though as a pretty standardized, regulated form of medicine. It's not really beyond the bounds. Now that said, okay, so there are beyond the bounds, like pangolin is illegal. Pangolin trade is illegal, but obviously it's a black market thing. So there is a market for it. Based on what I was kind of researching to write the piece, though, I think it's, it's a very small percentage of people in China who do this. Opinion, there are these public opinion surveys in the last few years that were like, would Chinese people support a ban on wild animals? And like overwhelming majority say yes, right? But, so I think what we can think of China as a society that's kind of is becoming increasingly bourgeois, right? It's moving up the value chain of the global order and so on, but it is obviously like a very stratified society. So in a city like Wuhan and Shanghai, most people there are like someone you would meet in any other global city, like London or New York, right? But there's a lot of stuff that it's over 1 billion people, right? We don't know what people do. They're anecdotally, I think the other thing that might get at what you're saying, or maybe something I can offer here, is that anecdotally talking to friends about lab leak versus wet market, there are a lot of ethnic Chinese people from China, from Hong Kong, who think wet market is very plausible or lab leak is very plausible. They might not want to say it publicly, right? But I didn't want to say in these articles that like only racists believe in this, right? Because there are a lot of people in China who are deeply suspicious and talk about like how there's a lot of unhygienic stuff, because there is, like these are very dense cities, and there's a sort of you rely upon a lot of informal labor to like take out the trash and clean up the streets and so on. And I'm pretty sure these labs employ a lot of informal labor where there probably could have been a leak, of an animal or something like that. So I didn't want to portray this as only racists or only Westerners believe in these theories. There are people in China who do think they are plausible. I don't know how much that's on like the social, like, Weibo, WeChat, or all that stuff. That might be something that you don't really get though from the English media, which is like people in China themselves are speculating about all this. There are a lot of ethnic Chinese people, and a lot of ethnic Chinese people don't like the CCP. A lot of people in China don't like the Chinese government. In Hong Kong, they don't like the Chinese government. So for a lot of the same reasons, they might also find loudly plausible. They're like, these fucking governments cover up. We don't trust, the official reports of how there's no COVID and it's not our fault. So that might be something that, like it's a complex society, as you would expect with 1 billion people. I don't know if Fan Young, if Fan, you want to add anything to that from your reading of Chinese media?
Many thanks, Andrew. Extremely helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Fan might still be cooking.
Yeah.
I might jump back in. So I want to return to the wet market piece, which is great. I think you're doing a wonderful job of taking us away from these logics that kind of blame the animal, or logics that blame the virulent zone, and focus in on these global linkages and commercial connections. How this unremarkable story of global movement and interchange, this prosaic story, might be the story of pandemic emergence.
Mm-hmm.
You give us historical context too, that 1950s, this is unimaginable. Those kinds of global connections weren't there. It's something that's emerged. And I'd also like to respond to something you said earlier, that in some ways, like talking about bat reservoirs and southern China, in some ways risks re-inscribing that logic of the virulent zone and blame the animal. So we had a conversation with Lin-Fa Wang last week, who came up with the bat coronavirus reservoir hypothesis, and he showed us this one slide of rhinolophid bats, which are horseshoe bats, the kind that carry coronavirus biodiversity, and they range from Japan through Southeast Asia to Southern Europe, through Africa. But there's a way that there's kind of a misplaced concreteness on that bat. We know that this virus is promiscuous. So I'm wondering if we can like pivot away from these stories of animals and so-called wet markets. We also had someone on here discussing like kind of the taxonomy of markets, why seafood markets might be wet because of melting ice.
Right.
But let's think about these global linkages and that history of how the unimaginable connections that weren't there in the 1950s became imagined, and not only imagined, but then became actual.
Yeah. So and I'm just like an amateur on this stuff. Are you saying that scientists, like natural scientists or virologists themselves, are kind of even skeptical that you could isolate it to Southwest China? Because my impression was they were just doing all this like statistical analysis and like kind of proving it's located in this part of China. But you think that's, even scientists themselves think there's no clear causality?
So the serology data, meaning you're taking blood samples and looking at antibodies, and also the mathematical models, suggest that there's about 400,000 transmission events of SARS-CoV related viruses in Southeast Asia in a given year. Right. So the question becomes not one of pinpointing an origin, but kind of conditions of emergence. And I'm very much thinking this with Foucault and Nietzsche in mind. Like, what are so Foucault cautions us against these origin stories, and inviting us to think about how forms of politics and power emerge amidst divided forces. So how might we use that same logic to understand conditions of emergence of a novel viral variant?
Right. Yeah. And I think one thing I was thinking as I was trying to write the piece was that sorry, that I think I had the line in there about like, I forget which random cities, like Dayton, Ohio, and Dar es Salaam. Like, you can imagine if something similar like this broke up in any of these cities, it would go global, you know? So on the one hand, you know, decentering any origin story, I think, or deprioritizing the origin story and prioritizing the global circuit, which is more important, right? For the spread, I think is one move. Yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to know what are the kind of assumptions and the methods of scientists who are trying to narrow down, is it impossible to know, you know, where it could have come from. Like, I mean, if we're saying that, or I'm saying that, you know, once something like this happens, because of the interconnected nature of the global economy, it's going to spread no matter what, right? And if we're kind of thinking ahead in terms of, well, what could we do in the future to stop this from happening again? I don't know what the solution is, because you're not going to slow down the global economy. You're not going to stop telling people to do global trade and global investment. So I don't know. I honestly don't know what I think if you, yeah, I mean, this is something I'm not sure how to think about this stuff going forward, because I worry about winding up in a place where we feel like really helpless about it, because it's like, it's inevitable. We can't figure out where it comes from and so on. And maybe that is like what the science is saying, but I mean, I'm curious what you all, you know, there was that in the middle of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was this New York Times article on trying to conclusively prove it was the wet market and not the lab leak. I don't know if you all remember that day. And it was like the front page news, but I feel like it made like almost no impact, right? And nobody cared because it was like, because of all this stuff happening in Russia and Ukraine. What did your group kind of discuss, like those papers? Because, you know, the paper, like the New York Times is really pushing these as like conclusive evidence. I don't know. I was reading them. I was reading commentary about them, and it just felt like people were like, "This is nothing new. There's so much speculation involved, and like, why are we still doing this in 2022?"
Let's see this. So there's lots of comments going on in the chat that I'm trying to follow. In addition to that, so yeah, we have engaged with a lot of the lab leak papers, going back to Christian Andersen's early analysis of the genomic components that basically found little evidence of like, if you look at the genome, what you see is a bunch, like thousands of what are called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs. So like individual mutations that are distributed throughout the genome, rather than like piece A, piece B, let's piece them together and create a new hybrid form. It's basically really hard to genetically engineer something like that. And most virologists will tell you, if you gave me like $100 million or like blue sky budget, I'd never be able to do this myself.
Okay.
Yeah, there's also a lot of renewed publications in the natural sciences about the wet market theory, and we've actually got some authors of those publications coming up in the group. We've got a member of the WHO team that went to the market, who's very skeptical of the origin story, pinning it on the market. He's an Australian physician, and basically sees evidence of a super spreader event, but not of, you know, a clear origin story. But there's Michael Warboys and Jonathan Pekar, who we've had on the group before, who are going to be looking at some of the modeling that they've done that have very carefully traced the viral genealogies of Wuhan, and they're convinced on the wet market story. But there are many scientists who are expanding the scope radically to think about many other possible stories.
Oh wow, okay. Yeah, I mean, I'd be, if you said that we could never find the source, then we could just think of the wet market as like a super spreader event, but without ever knowing the source. Like, I think that's probably, you know, totally plausible and acceptable. Yeah, and you know, I'm just curious, like, I wonder, like, what are the politics? I guess this is what I was kind of asking in the second piece, like, what are the politics of this stuff at this point, right? Because the lab leak theory, there's a pretty clear politics involved, right? Which is like, contain China. China is up to no good. There's a sort of national security / economic dimension rolled up in one in the lab leak theory. And so it's less about COVID, it's much more about the sort of existential threat of China to the Europe and the US. With wet market, I don't really, so there's a lot of this stuff is, you know, a lot of it is like politics on top of science, or politics overshadowing the science of it.
Maybe back to this idea of what was unimaginable in the 1950s and what is unimaginable now.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, you talked about the end of capitalism. It's hard to imagine.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's been said before. But to me, it strikes me as like something more specific than the end of capitalism, right? And I think what we've seen in the last 2 years is, you know, a serious disruption to global flows.
Yes.
And also global supply chains that have been reconfigured amidst unpredictability. So yeah, I guess I'm just wondering what is imaginable.
I don't know what's so to give a more historically specific argument, and this is kind of what I say in the Feral Atlas piece, is to periodize this a little bit more. And this is like my own research, so you know, this is what I'm thinking about. But I do think something happened starting in the 70s and the 80s with East Asia kind of as this hub for the global economy. You know, there's a lot of talk about shipping containers and the containerized economy, and then just in time, which is all about having like very little extra stuff in your store, but just having stuff continually bringing it up. And what makes that possible is this revolution in transport. And that is a relatively distinct moment, right? That wasn't, regardless of China being embargoed by the rest of the world, that just was not how the global economy was organized in the 50s and 60s. This begins in the 70s. There's a kind of familiar story I'm sure people have heard of. Mark Levinson writes about the box, or the history of containerized shipping, where it just makes it so much cheaper to just rely upon Asian labor, which at the time Asian countries were much poorer than the United States, so labor costs are much cheaper. And if you look at all the statistics for like where shipping takes, like people talk about the globalization of shipping containers as if it's a global phenomenon, but I think the overall concentration is like the number one shipping ports are typically like Shanghai and Singapore. And so it's like really, and more broadly, an argument I think I'm going to make in the historical standpoint is like, if we think about the global history of capitalism, after World War II, it's still very much a North Atlantic phenomenon, Western Europe, United States as a center of the global economy. By the 70s and 80s, it's the Pacific, much more so. Depending on what you're looking at, like finance versus manufacture and all that stuff. So I don't know I don't know what practical solutions this gives us, but I think as a historian, or as someone kind of thinking about capitalism seriously, I think what COVID, in a lot of ways, are both its kind of super spreaderness, but also like the problems that arose as a result of it, is all very much reflecting or illuminating different aspects of this Asia Pacific global economy that was created in the 70s and the 80s, both in terms of like what gave rise to the pandemic, but also what did the pandemic break, right? And what are we kind of struggling to piece back together? And to get to Fan's original question, like part of the problem with COVID-0 is that even though China has been doing okay at different moments in the last 2 years, every time there's an outbreak and every time these Asian countries, especially China, tries to enforce COVID-0, that is like a self-imposed economic shock, on one's own country. And I don't know. I don't know if the pre-2019 global economy will ever be pieced back together in its current form. But from what my research has, but based on what I've been reading, like there were attempts by China itself to stop being so dependent on global trade, and China can't do it because nobody else can make anything. They just need China to make everything for them, and even China itself is like, we got to start promoting domestic consumption and promoting the middle class, but they just can't. They can't end their own addiction to global exports either.
Fan, do you want to jump back in?
If no one else has an immediate comment, I do want to follow up on that. One question, two things. One question is what you think of the rhetoric of delinking that is happening, and especially given the recent self-imposed economic shock. And another question, actually, is kind of the parallel to Evan's question about comparing then and now, especially as someone who has also been learning from Asian American studies. I actually meant to read Colleen Lai's Americanized Asia, and I even borrowed it. And then now that I've seen you quoting,
just read the introduction
from it.
I think it's really
okay. Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading that finally. But one question I struggle with in my own manuscript right now is I'm kind of arguing for more specific attention to the racialization of the state with regards to the so-called rising China, which I would say differs in some ways, perhaps from what Lai calls the Asiatic form, or maybe it's a particular formation of that. And I'm curious what you might think of that, because I'm getting some pushback saying that, calling racialization of state seems to be an exaggeration. So really curious what you think of that.
Yeah. Why don't I just talk about that? Because the linking thing, I honestly don't have much more to say other than like, we'll see how it goes, you know? But also I think it is related to this racialization question. And I thought, I was rereading the piece before this, I thought it might be useful to kind of like lay my cards on the table, like, because you're all academics, right? And not, for N+1, I was trying to like make it as accessible as possible. But like my theory, what I think Colleen is doing and what I think my own approach is, and it's certainly far from complete, is a theory of racialization that is very much inspired by Marx's theory of commodity fetishism, which I'm sure many of you have read, like Volume 1, Capital, first chapter, commodity fetishism. And there's really great work on like Black racism, inspired by Marx's approach, on anti-Semitism, inspired by Marx's approach. And I think Colleen is trying to do that, the same thing with Asian Americans. And the basic theory is like Marx's whole theory is basically capitalism is this impossibly complex system. It's unimaginable, unrepresentable. Because it's so complex, economists don't understand it, right? Like they don't see crises coming. But also B, the thing that really makes the capitalism move is labor, but labor is hidden, right? Marx calls it the hidden abode of production. You go to a restaurant, you see the menu, you see the food, you see the servers, you don't see the kitchen, right? And that's how the economy, a global capitalist economy is set up. So given that capitalism is incredibly dynamic and complex, but we don't see the actual agent, which is labor, in front of us, we tend to attribute agency after the fact to things like, in Marx's example, is commodities. We attribute agency to network computers. And I think what these people are trying to say is like, well, race kind of plays, this is also explains the emergence of race as this kind of static thing that we attribute agency to. So, like during economic crises, like why is it this group that is kind of seen as the scapegoated as the group that's responsible for destroying the US economy or the European economy or whatever. Now, why exactly it takes that particular form I'm not really sure, right? But the evidence, I think you can compile evidence. And so this is like my reading of like the scapegoating, not the scapegoating, the way that we have this global economy. It's basically been in crisis for 30, 40 years. It has all these ups and downs. But we don't understand it as a global economy. We understand it as the Chinese economy, the US economy, the European economy. And, for those who've read like Timothy Mitchell, the national economy is a new invention. It's anachronistic and artificial. We think of it in terms of like, how are Black people doing? How are Asian people doing? How are white people doing? We don't think of it as like this, complex interdependent thing. And so I think both Asian Americans, Asian people, diaspora, and Asian countries, and this is probably true of like, any sort of group, right, or any nation, this is the unit through which we tend to understand capitalism rather than capitalism itself. And that is what gives rise to, I think, what Colleen is calling especially this notion of an Asiatic racial form, which is to say, her argument is like, if East Asia is no longer seen as the backward society of Edward Said's Orientalism, but is instead seen as this kind of vanguard that is threatening to swallow up Euro-America, right? Like first Japan, now China. That is, in a way, it is real in the sense that yes, Japan, then China, and East Asia have done very well. But it is like, it's both like, what gives it plausibility is that it's like half real, but also half fantasy, right? It's half demonization. So again, the reason Lab Leak is now stuck more than Wet Market is because it seems to more accurately represent the China of 2022, not a backward society that eats bats, right? But a secretive world power that is creating bioweapons, right? So so just to kind of lay my cards on the table, that is my reading of race and a lot of this stuff. And in terms of like the racialization and versus the state question, fine, I think this is actually part of the issue with like a lot of US discourse about this, where the standard line both by liberal Asian American activists, but also like conservative politicians, is blame China, but keep China away from Asian Americans, right? And so like all this stuff about wet market versus lab leak, right? Wet market is not okay because it portrays Asians as racist, as backwards, and that's racist, right? And we had all these think pieces about why the wet market is not an okay thing to say. But it's okay to entertain lab leak, right? Because that is respecting China as a modern country. Similarly, when Tim Ryan, I don't know if those following the news in the United States, Tim Ryan, this Democrat in basically Youngstown, Ohio, which is Trump country, is trying to win Trump votes by demonizing China, right? Tim Ryan can both demonize China, but also co-sponsor a bill against anti-Asian racism in the United States, right? This is a binary that I think all sides are kind of basically playing along with this idea that it's very easy to say don't be xenophobic and don't be racist. What's harder is to actually confront what is the relationship between the US and the Chinese economy in a way that's more complex than China is winning and we're losing. I don't think most liberal, including Asian American groups, right, have a real way to address this. So they just basically default to that's racist. Don't be racist, right? But like they're not addressing the thing that Tim Ryan is doing, which is addressing the fact that many workers in the United States blame China for losing their jobs. That's a real material reality that undergirds that gives a lot of this stuff purchase, and that's not really being addressed with a simplistic racism theory, right? Is my view.
Thank you so much. That gave me more confidence to endorse my own claim that there's something about the particular form of the Chinese state, the way it appears in some of these representations and processes that you mentioned.
Right.
It's simultaneously an agent as in lab theory,
right.
But also it is a subject that is then kind of embodied subject that is then objectified and othered as this power that's threatening. So thank you so much for that.
I think it's the global economy fetishized into easy target. Rachel also has a comment I thought that from earlier if was worth elaborating on.
Yeah, I was about to pull that out of the chat.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, there's my mind is now aware with all the new ideas that were just said, and I think actually you captured some of what I wanted to ask based on this quote. I mean, there's so many great quotes in here, so just beautiful writing. But this quote in particular, I mean, I am write about waste. I'm a waste scholar, so this particularly interested me on this component of accumulation. But I think you particularly captured that just in your last comment in some way as well, about like not getting at these sort of dynamics of accumulation and trade and some of the complexities of those conversations across, at least in U.S. context and in European context, across kind of political lines. So I think you captured some of what I was trying to just to dig out of that quote.
Yeah, just to put my cards on the table, with this quote, I'm just working through the use value, exchange value, ideas in Marx that, the point of capitalism isn't to produce stuff. The point of capitalism is to produce value. So there's a paradox where if you have too much stuff, you actually get poor, right? And that is at the time, at March 2020, the big news I remember, I don't know if anyone really remembers this, right? There was the day that's, I think Saudi Arabia, right? Like upped production of oil, crashed the stock market. And it was just like so bizarre that I was trying to figure out what it meant. Like I never really understand this stuff. So I have to like figure it out. And when I figured it out, I was like, wait, that means we have extra oil, or like China has produced extra steel, but this destroys the global economy. And that kind of gets at like the heart of like why it was impossible to stop trading and moving and all that stuff. And then, yeah, like more broadly and relating to what I was just talking about, right? Like I think of, if you think like, I think of the best way to conceptualize capitalism is like the real thing that drives a lot of the stuff is capital itself, which has no nationality or loyalty to any particular region. It is just like this constant demand to produce more value, right? Not stuff, but produce value. And then the fuck up happens when we attribute a nation or a race or a group to what is basically this kind of deterritorial thing called capital. At least in 2022, like it used to be more territorial, but now it's quite deterritorialized.
Thanks, Andrew.
Yeah, no, thanks for the question.
There's a comment from David in the chat. Any parallels you see between discourses regarding Chernobyl and COVID-19? I'm thinking of the long histories of anti-communist ideologies regarding USSR China, including the portrayal of the other as unable to lead the global political economy.
Yeah. I don't remember, or I wasn't there for Chernobyl, and I don't know the discourse around it, but I assume it's something like when Chernobyl happens, this is symbolic of like the USSR's incapacity. And like this is like part of like, you know, this is like the lead up to the end of the USSR, right? Like if they allow this massive accident to happen. And I think, so it's like a declining power. And I think what a lot of this COVID-0 stuff in China is China trying to assert itself as a legitimate ascendant power, right? Like COVID might have begun or spread in our country, right? But we're going to lead the world in stopping it and proving both the Chinese, especially the Chinese citizens, but also to the rest of the world, that the Chinese government is better equipped than any other Western government or non-Chinese government to deal with it. Yeah, so I think there's definitely a sort of political theater involved in a lot of this stuff, where it becomes symbolic of like which governments are legitimate or which ones are more effective than others.
So I also wanted to elevate some of the things that you were saying about techno-orientalism from the lab leak theory piece. You know, this is a long literary tradition, I think, going back to Dr. Fu Manchu, the British colonial novel of 1912.
Right. Yeah.
And, you know, you see it reemerge. I wrote about Dr. He Zhanghui, who did the CRISPR babies, and it was very much using a techno-orientalist framework to kind of grapple with images from, you know, Blade Runner and the Matrix that were kind of getting in the way of what was actually taking place in Shenzhen. So could you say more about how you know, techno-orientalism is playing out in the lab leak theory, and yeah, how these older modes of, you know, the Orientalist tropes surrounding the wet market are interacting with these emergent tropes?
Yeah, and so techno-oriental, and I'm like a kind of a newcomer to this stuff. I was talking to people in like Asian American literature who introduced me to some of these concepts. But like looking at a volume on this stuff recently, this seems to, in my view, sort of like the techno-orientalism is giving a name to these sort of cultural forms, cultural products like movies and novels from the 30s. And I mean, the first thing is like techno-orientalism is different than like Said's Orientalism, right? Again, Said is about how the British and the French colonized Islamic societies by calling them inferior, whereas techno-orientalism, on the one hand, it's dehumanizing, but like these movies are like science fiction movies talking about how Asia is actually more advanced and more scientific. So it's the directionality of the relationship to the world is kind of in polar opposite positions. And then like digging beyond that, though, I was trying to suggest, and why I think Colleen lies, what I was kind of suggesting is techno-orientalism is an expression of this deeper structural relationship, which is where I found plausible in Colleen Lai's argument, which again is about how it's not that Asians are more technologically advanced, it's like they're economically advanced, and then technology is an expression of that economic like vanguardism. And you're right, it dates back to, you know, for her, she traces it back to basically the anti-Chinese exclusion politics of the 1870s and 80s, and then goes to like Japanese internment and so on. So Fu Manchu is definitely part of that. And I think to her credit, she has drawn connections between, in the United States, there's anti-Asian American stuff, but the real at the time, people around the world were connecting the dots between Asian immigrants to the United States as taking away jobs and, you know, working longer hours, and this is unfair. They were connecting the dots with the rise of Japan as this global power. In Asian history, the big moment is the Russo-Japanese War, where when Japan defeats Russia in 1905, it is celebrated around the world as the first Asian yellow race to defeat the white race. Basically taking the language of the European racial science and turning it on its head. So there's anecdotes of like Nehru in India or people in Turkey celebrating Japan's victory over Russia. Like, why should they care about Japan? Like, well, it's because this kind of racial logic of the 19th century had taken over. So that's the kind of international context, and connecting the dots, right? All these incidents like Asian migration to California, the rise of Japan, they're all kind of they're all transforming the Orientalism of Edward Said, right, which is Asia's backwards, to a new Orientalism, which one expression is techno-Orientalism, right, of Asia's economically hyper-efficient, which continues obviously with China in the 21st century.
So Frederic has got his hand up. He's joining us from France.
Hi.
Yes, sorry I'm joining you late, and you may have talked about this issue, but I wondered what were your thoughts about the third hypothesis beside the wet market and the lab leak theory, which is the frozen product exported from abroad, which has been used by the Chinese government. Do you see it as a way to reverse Orientalist tropes and the form of techno-modernism rather than techno-Orientalism?
Yeah. What is the frozen product?
So the idea that the virus comes from abroad and
Right.
in frozen products and has been found in markets.
But did they specify what product and where it came from?
Well, it was salmon coming from Norway.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Pork coming from the US.
Yeah. And early on, the counter conspiracy theory was that in Wuhan, in I believe October of 2019, there was this kind of international games, like very small, like one of these miniature Olympic games, and the theory was that the United States brought it to Wuhan in October, and then it spread in December. Yeah, that seems to me as pretty straightforward, like counter nationalism or counter, just like a defensive reaction, you know, to the demonization of China by saying it's actually the United States' fault. I don't think anyone in the world really believes it, but it might have legitimacy within China for Chinese citizens who kind of are true believers in the CCP and the CCP media. I think that a lot of stuff is obviously just aimed at Chinese citizens or Chinese diaspora who are nationalists. It's not really aimed to convince like anyone, like in this room, for instance, you know, like I don't think any of us would take it seriously unless they actually have the evidence. Like it'd be amazing if they actually found the salmon that spread it from Norway.
Coughing salmon. Fan, you have some more questions in the chat.
Oh, not really a question, but I was just inspired to incorporate more of this piece that you wrote on Lab Leak into my claim about what I call fiscal Orientalism regarding China's rise, which particularly pertains to the state, the fear of the state. And in this case, you see kind of an entwinement between techno and fiscal Orientalism in some ways, especially think about the state as a techno agent. So I was really appreciating that inspiration that you gave me.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's definitely another angle one could take. Yeah. I've been thinking about this stuff recently. I think it's, it's potentially, you know, it's really interesting. I was at this conference this weekend on like neoliberalism and the developing world, basically BRICS. If anyone knows that term, Goldman Sachs in 2001, they named the hottest markets Brazil, Russia, India, China, then South Africa. It's kind of this famous thing, basically rebranding developing markets as like a hot investment in 2001. So the conference was organized around like, what does neoliberalism look like in the rest of the world? And like the whole conference, the assumption was like South Korea is hot, you know, like they were a success story and East Asia is a success story. And there was none of this talk of East Asia as backwards and not modern. And so I think in that world of people who study economics and international political economy, this has been known for a while that East Asia is actually like the success story. It's like a hyper-modern, it represents the hyper-modern world that like East Europe looks up to East Asia, South America looks up to East Asia, right? And I think the humanists, like my world, and historians and literature people have been fighting this kind of straw person for a while about how East Asia is seen as backwards. It's like maybe 30 years ago, that's true. But I think the reality in like for these disciplines where there's like a lot more interchange with the real world, like I think East Asia has been updated, for a while. And so I think there's a lot of ground, for fun for your research and, stuff I've been thinking about for humanists to kind of get in on this.
Great, thanks. Well, that brings us right to the hour. So thank you, Andrew. This was delightful.
Yeah, thanks so much for
Zoom
for reading.
for you. And next,
quickly,
go ahead, Svan.
I shared a book in the chat that might interest some people, which is by Asian American studies folks called Techno-Orientalism.
Yeah, it's a great book. I can also recommend David Rowe's edited collection. It's been inspirational for me. It's exploring this long theme of evil Oriental geniuses that steal Western knowledge and threaten the downfall of civilization. Next week, Sevgi is going to present some of her work. Would you like to give a brief little plug for the paper you're discussing with us next week?
Yeah, I'm going to share you tomorrow, so you will read more.
Okay, look for it on your email. So thanks so much, everyone, for coming. So lovely to see so many people back. Keep thinking the pandemic's going to be over and we're going to gather someday. Maybe it'll happen. But yeah, lovely to see everybody back on Zoom, and see you soon.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Bye.
Thanks.